the internet's busiest music nerd. And it's time for a
Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, the internet's poppiest music nerd. And it's time for a review of this new pop music. Is it any good? This is the 7th full-length decade of pop music's existence as its own distinct genre, and throughout it all, pop music has long been maligned and seen as lesser than. And we especially see this among the youth over the internet, zooming into the early 2010s in the era of Lady Gaga and Nicki Minaj and Justin Bieber. The internet was rife with kids and teenagers whining about how music of this era is so dumb and stupid and gay, and how I was born in the wrong generation. But over the course of the 2010s, we would see a shift start to happen. These pop figures that were once seen as disposable and indicative of the death of culture now seem to have an unprecedented level of respect. And now, the pop acts of today, like Charli XCX and Chappell Roan and Sabrina Carpenter, are now not only very successful, but are critical darlings with their own solid online fan bases who connect with their image and aesthetic. And even looking outside the mainstream, some of the most innovative and compelling artists nowadays who are crafting deeply meaningful lyrics and aren't afraid to be experimental with their music and pull from different sources also have the pop label attached to them, and sometimes even wear it proudly. Whether it's acts like new metal J-pop influenced Rina Sawayama, or Caroline Polachek harkening back to lush art pop, or Janelle Monáe's modern take on 80s folk and R&B, or Loewe's more straightforward throwback pop, or the insane off-the-wall production of 100 gecs or Dorian Electra. It's clear that we're living in an age where folks are no longer allergic to the pop label, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next. I'm giving this one a strong 7 to a light 8. Transition. Okay. You may or may not be familiar with the word Poptimism, a term used to refer to this critical reevaluation of pop music, and that pop is good, actually. That making music that's fun and catchy is as good or worthy a cause as any to make music. We will tackle Poptimism in this video, but as a child of the internet, what I really want to hone in on is how this all played out in my experience. And I have my blind spots. I'll mainly tackle pop culture through acts that were big in the US, so I may not be aware of how pop music evolved in the context of other countries or cultures, like K-pop, for example. And if you have any inputs or insights that you want to share in that regard, I'd love to hear it in the comments. So let's talk about how pop music came to be more respected over the internet. And spoilers, Queen of Pop, Carly Rae Jepsen, may have something to do with it. But first, this video isn't sponsored. But if you'd like more bonus content, you want to help the channel out, and you have the means to do so, I've launched a Patreon and YouTube memberships. Same perks either way. For just $2 a month, you can hear me ramble off the cuff about things like my creative process, aka how I make videos, or how YouTube shaped me as a person, among other things. You can also get verbal shoutouts, and if we have enough patrons and members, maybe even a special Discord server or live streams. But only if you want or can. Either way, I super appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. Okay, back to the video. So, the pop in pop music is derived from the word popular. Wow. But that also kind of doesn't make sense as far as genre conventions go. What if the most popular songs or artists of a given time period fall under the category of rock or rap? Are those considered pop? Isn't pop supposed to be fun, catchy, stuff that you could dance to? And for that matter, if a pop song by a pop artist is released and that doesn't become popular, does that still make it pop? Okay, quick crash course. Way back in the 1950s and 60s, rock and pop were actually used interchangeably, with rock and roll being the hot, new thing and the sound that a lot of teenagers were listening to, as opposed to folk, jazz, or classical. But something happened in the 1960s. This is when rock and pop became their own separate things. Rock music became the sound of the youth and a symbol of rebellion and protest. The emphasis now was on louder, heavier, guitar-driven sounds. Rock connected with something real and authentic. This stood in stark contrast with pop music, which was designed to have the biggest appeal, which felt soft and frivolous in comparison. Music for the masses. Wake up, sheeple! Pop singers would sing about love or heartbreak or dancing or whatever, but it didn't mean anything. They don't mean it. A pop song just needed to be catchy and or relatable enough to get people to buy your single. It was disposable. At least that was popular perception for a time. But then, in urban areas in the US where attendees of gay bars and clubs were subjected to harassment and violence, folks would host invite-only underground parties, primarily attended by Black and or LGBT people. And DJs would be hired to spin music that was fast, up-tempo R&B with pulsating, catchy 4/4 beats that could make people come together and dance the night away and forget the horrible, horrible world outside. This was the birth of disco music. And in a way, isn't making music like that to escape and cultivate that space where you feel accepted and are allowed to have fun? Isn't that just as noble a cause as the defiant, anti-authoritative spirit of rock music? In the 1970s, disco would become the sound of pop, codifying a lot of characteristics that we associate with pop today. This is where we primarily get our idea of pop being upbeat and bubbly and meant to get us to dance. During that decade, disco would then explode onto the mainstream, being responsible for the biggest hits of that decade. Despite some of the biggest disco artists actually being white straight men, disco never lost its perceived connection to the Black and gay communities, which makes what happened in 1979 all the more shocking. A radio DJ arranged a disco demolition publicity stunt at a baseball game where people could bring disco records to be obliterated, blown up at the center of the field. It was spurred on by this fury, this indignation that rock music, the authentic and important genre, was being crowded out by disco, the bad, disposable pop music. And that event got out of control. And with disco's concrete ties to marginalized groups, some critics argue that this whole moment carried with it a heavy subtext of racism and homophobia. While disco demolition may have spelled out the end for disco on the charts, the sound of pop music would still be heavily shaped by disco, with its use of robot-like electronic synths, mechanical beats, and simple, catchy melodies. Even some disco refugees would go on to shape pop music on the production side of things. But the tension between the good rock music versus the commercial, mass appeal pop music, that tension never went away. Like, for example, Billie Jean, now considered the song and video of the 1980s, was initially rejected by MTV because MTV was a rock station, and Billie Jean wasn't a rock song. And also, MTV wasn't really playing a lot of black artists around that time. This tendency to uphold rock music at a much higher standard over pop music or rockism came to a head in 2004, when New York Times contributor Kelefa Sane wrote the piece The Rap Against Rockism, an often cited article when discussing Poptimism because of how the article treats rockism with a certain contempt. Sane posits that maybe rock isn't as authentic as it portrays itself to be, and that artists from disco or folk or hip-hop only are ever given serious consideration or seen as good whenever they incorporate rock and roll sensibilities or gestures. But do they have to do that in order to get that acclaim? And he also alludes to the idea of whether this whole rockism thing could be linked to questions of homophobia or racism. Could it really be a coincidence that rockist complaints often pit straight white men against the rest of the world? Like the anti-disco backlash of 25 years ago, the current rockist consensus seems to reflect not just an idea of how music should be made, but also an idea about who should be making it. Now, everything I just said, like literally all of it, was based off of published readings and articles and professional writers and critics and journalists, smart people. But I am a child of the internet. I don't read. Ew. Words. Ugh. Okay, so we get it. Critics were doing whatever it is that critics do, but what about the bored teenagers and kids on the interwebs? Well, there's a lot of things here to consider. Number one, the internet has so thoroughly shifted the ways in which we consume music, specifically with the rise of the MP3 format, which I guess you could buy legally or ethically through iTunes, but I know some people who source their music through freely shared MP3 files on file sharing websites, or burned CDs, or even youtube-mp3.com. Does anyone remember that? But for legal reasons, I never used any of those methods. I am a good, law-abiding citizen. Anyway, point is, music, songs and albums from any artist of any time period and any genre suddenly became a lot easier than ever to access and play. Even older artists from previous generations that you probably weren't even alive for. At the same time though, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, pop music was just so big. With its huge bombastic beats, best played at the club, the so-called recession-era pop just felt overpowering, even suffocating. And it wasn't just the sound. Because we weren't as attached to our phones like we are now, pop music just felt inescapable. Establishments would just play top 40 radio, or if you were a preteen or teen planning a good time with your friends, the big pop party music of that era just provided a good backdrop. At the time, you could not escape Black Eyed Peas, or LMFAO, or Pitbull. And lastly, let us not forget teenagers' propensity to hate on things. And I mean, this is true for every generation, but the internet has made it so especially easy to bring that hate to the forefront, to prop up anything that anyone ever did, and hold it up against the cruel, unwavering glare of the social media spotlight and say, look at the bad thing that someone did. Isn't it bad? So, with all the confluence of factors, the accessibility of music from the past, the bigness of pop, the hate, I must regretfully introduce you, or reintroduce you, to one unfortunate piece of internet ephemera, which is... Okay, so some kids and teens felt that pop music of that era, like Bieber or Beyonce or One Direction, were bad. And they would take a look at this old music like the Beatles or Queen or whatever and see that music and think that's good. And so, using brilliant deductive reasoning, these same people concluded that all music from the olden times was good and that all music today was bad. And they wish they could have experienced music in the old times, not like the garbage we have now. They were born in Le Wrong Generation. Okay, so like Le is a reference to like those old Rage comics because random is funny. And if you don't know what Rage comics are, they're like old, like I think nowadays kids call it soy jacks. You know what? Don't even worry about it. Also, this is what memes used to look like, kids. Be kind to a millennial today. We've been through a lot. It's hard to even describe what exactly Le Wrong Generation is, or was. And for this video, I'm going to call anyone who perpetuated that mentality Defeners. It's easier to say. But it was unclear whether Le Wrong Generation was a group of people, an anti-pop music sentiment, a movement. Well, whatever it was, it deeply manifested in the language of the internet, which are memes. Yeah, there were a bunch of memes in the more quote-unquote mainstream websites like 9gag or iFunny, talking about how much better music was back then. Why don't we take a look at some moldy memes in all their pixelated low-res glory? These are truly the spoiled, rotten leftovers left behind in the refrigerator of time. Okay. So this meme compares to music then, and then a bunch of instruments versus music now, and then I don't want to live in this planet anymore. Oh, here was a popular format that these memes took. They would put two sets of lyrics side by side, one from a dumb garbage pop artist, and one from good rock artist. And of course, this isn't just a case of intentionally choosing the most repetitive lyrics from a modern song and the most profound lyrics from an older song. No, of course not. Why would somebody manipulate the narrative like that? That just doesn't make any sense. Oh, here's another one of those kinds of memes. Here, comparing Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven and Nicki Minaj's Anaconda. But I must say that this meme's label says top chart hit songs. Stairway to Heaven never topped any chart at the time because it wasn't released as a single. And Anaconda only peaked at number 2 for a week. Ding ding, plot hole! There was so much good music in the past because audio technology was not so advanced and the musicians had to be actually good. Whoa. Here's a YouTube comment from a Queen video with a lot of likes, so it must have resonated with a lot of people.
Why you crying, son? I was born in wrong generation. Haha, I am not. Lucky you.
Compelling stuff. Aaron Sorkin is shaking and crying right now. Actually, going back and looking at old YouTube comments of any music video, you may see a lot of this mentality like, oh, all music of the past was so much better. Okay, I'm not gonna read out this entire Rage comic, but the summary is, main character, the guy, is listening to Pink Floyd, girl doesn't know who that is, calls them pink fools, girl listens to dumb, stupid pop stars like Nicki Minaj, Gaga, and Bieber, and then she offers to replace the dude's music with much better music and calls Pink Fools stupid. And then, and then he says, "No, you foolish slut!" And then extremely violently flips the table. And then the last frame is just, "I regret nothing." So let's workshop this idea a little bit. Test audience results came back. They have a few notes. First of all, they felt that this was a tad violent, so maybe you could temper that down a bit. Secondly, the girl starts off not knowing who Pink Floyd is, and then within a few frames calls them stupid. What? Ding, plot hole! But let's appreciate the straw manning here. As someone who lived through 2011, I don't remember a lot of girls approaching me and... well, I could just end the sentence there. I did not have a lot of girls approach me ordering me to change my 60s doo-wop and Motown playlists. It's likely that the dude who made this Rage comic never experienced anything close to this and is just externalizing his feelings of feeling left out for not liking the pop music of that era. Which is fine, there's nothing wrong with not liking something, it's so violent. So here's one that uses gay as a pejorative to mock the trendy, teeny bopper acts of the time. One Direction, gay. Jonas Brother, gay. Justin Bieber, ultra gay. But Neil Patrick Harris, the good, straight-acting guy from How I Met Your Mother, is a homosexual. That is a whole nother can of worms I cannot get into now, but quite a few of these Defeners memes had that casual internet homophobia that was popular at the time, because gay and feminine is bad. And also, none of these people are even gay, come on. I don't want this entire video to be ancient memes, but I'm just going to say that there were so many other memes that I'm leaving out for this video. This anti-pop mentality was just so prevalent. Now, if you were not a fan of pop music in 2011 or whatever, that doesn't make you homophobic or even really wrong. A lot of that music was super repetitive and so many songs at the time sounded alike. I can see why people would be turned off and have a disdain for any kind of top 40 radio at the time. But I do feel like the Defeners maybe did take that disdain a little too far. So a lot of bands that were propped up by these Defeners were legendary bands with storied careers like the Beatles, Queen, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Nirvana, Metallica. Great bands, all among the best-selling musical acts of all time. But if I may, the choice of those bands was also a little generic. It's like putting I like all rock music on your dating profile. It's just a little basic. I mean, isn't the whole point of this movement to feel superior for not liking what everybody else likes, while also listing down the most obvious rock acts ever? And what I find particularly interesting is who I don't see listed in these memes as being proof that music was so much better back then. Like, where was the timeless soft rock of Fleetwood Mac? Or the folk rock of Simon and Garfunkel? Or the proto-punk of the Velvet Underground? Or the prog metal of Tool? Or the alt-rock Game Changers REM? But beyond that, there is one obvious genre that is missing from all of these. See, hip-hop hadn't quite been mythologized yet in the early 2010s with this particular crowd, so you just aren't going to see the likes of Tupac, or Nas, or Public Enemy, or Wu-Tang Clan. Or even going way further back in these memes, I never saw the names of soul R&B legends like Stevie Wonder, or Marvin Gaye, or Diana Ross. Maybe because they were too close to being pop, I don't know. A part of me feels that the Defeners, who were likely kids and teens, simply inherited the rockism and general tastes of their father's generation, kinda harkening back to the whole decades-long tension between rock and pop. But this didn't even get to the heart of what makes the Defeners' mentality so flawed. What makes the sentiment so shoddy is the goddamn cherry picking! Like, oh my god, it's so blatant! Like, oh, whoa, look at all these cherries that were picked! You know what? Maybe music back then was actually a lot better than music now. But that's a lot easier to say when back then refers to a whole 30 to 40 year stretch, and music now fits within a window of 2 to 3 years. And not just that, but it's a lot easier to romanticize those decades when you're whittling it down to a few classic artists and songs that stood the test of time, and it may not have reflected what people were actually listening to. An entry from a Crack.com article at the time, which was written in response to the Defeners refuting a lot of their points, they put it really well. Crap from previous eras gets forgotten, leaving only the great stuff behind. Those stuff on classic rock stations are obviously cherry-picked as the best and most indicative of an entire era. It's not a random sampling of all the music available at the time. Modern rock or pop stations, on the other hand, have to play whatever's come out in the past 6 months or so. Although, I feel the need to point out that that same Cracked article does have a little quip about Lady Gaga, implying that she would one day be irrelevant. Stream mayhem! There are so many examples I could put here about how a lot of old music that people were actually listening to was not that great, even overshadowed by now classics. Like how in 1976, on the year-end Hot 100, greatest song of all time, Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen, was outcharted by schmaltzy, soft rock cheese, and least sexy sex song of all time, Afternoon Delight. But my favorite old music is bad anecdote is Alvin and the Chipmunks, which is not only a terrible 2007 movie, but a musical act that started way back in the 1950s. Here they are performing on the Ed Sullivan Show, the same show where the Beatles made history. Alvin and the Chipmunks had 2 number 1s on Billboard. They have 5 Grammys! That's 5 more than Jimi Hendrix got in his lifetime! I don't want to live on this planet anymore! In fact, Anthony Fantano, who, love him or hate him, is the biggest and most influential online music critic, and possibly the biggest music critic of all time, actually made a video responding to the whole "the wrong generation" movement. This video has since been deleted or unlisted, but I did find a transcript. His approach, being the massive music nerd that he is, was to highlight amazing albums that were from this generation to show that, like, no, you were not born in the wrong generation. The albums may not have had Katy Perry level hits or get much airplay on the radio at the time, but they were still albums that he felt deserved recognition. Among those albums were The Strokes' Is This It?, Daft Punk's Discovery, Janelle Monáe's Arc Android, Kendrick Lamar with Good Kid Mad City, before Kendrick would become like a massive household name. Well, first of all those albums are... And all of them, over 10 years after that video was made, are now considered to be modern classics and will likely be remembered for many years to come. And also, can I ask, when Defeners illustrate how terrible all pop music is, why is Rebecca Black in some of these memes? Well, number one, she would go on to become a really legit pop artist afterward. Number two, her one song that time got big because it was famously bad. Almost nobody was listening to Friday unironically. It's like saying that the music of the 60s was bad because of the existence of the Shags. Outsider art pioneers, honestly. And so, with Defeners and their flawed logic running rampant on the internet, some resistance was starting to form. People trying to push back on that Defender mentality, like, wait, are you sure you aren't just cherry-picking good music from the past and all that? There was that Cracked article, that Anthony Fantano video. But most notably, a subreddit would start to form, r/Le Wrong Generation. A subreddit meant to mock and poke fun at the mentality of the Defenders. It was super important for this whole section of the video because I sourced all my memes from 10-year-old posts on that subreddit. Plus, it was the origin of the word Defenders, where it started being used pejoratively to refer to those folks. But this subreddit, which at the end of the day was essentially a cringe subreddit to ridicule this type of behavior, has 300,000 members now. That's how despised Defenders were on the rest of the internet. It's since remained active, expanding its scope to mock anyone with any self-superiority fueled by nostalgia or quasi-nostalgia, but its origins are still from that weird anti-pop music sentiment of the early 2010s. And you know, nowadays, I'm sure you'll find people who hate pop music or think all current day pop music is garbage. But in the 2020s, this the wrong generation mentality isn't nearly as popular as it was back in the early 2010s. You don't see these sort of posts shitting on, I don't know, Charli XCX or Olivia Rodrigo this antagonistically, or comparing them to Queen or Led Zeppelin or Nirvana as if that makes any sense. Why is that? Why did everybody just suddenly stop hating on pop music so viciously? Well, I will unironically make a case that it all has to do with our Queen. Please rise for the national anthem. So to provide a bit of background as to what was happening on the internet in 2015, firstly, the way we all listened to music kind of shifted with the unexpected and exponential rise of streaming platforms. It was just like ripping MP3s off of LimeWire, but made even more convenient with better curation and faster. And even more ethically, so you could listen to your favorite artist guilt-free if that was at all a concern. In fact, streaming quickly began overtaking radio as how young people primarily legally consumed music. With people listening to whatever the heck they wanted to, top 40 pop radio became far less of a concern to young people at the time. Even establishments like shops or restaurants were just playing their own Spotify playlists or whatever. And with a smartphone and a cheap $10 headset, it could have been possible to go through 2015 without having heard a single current-day pop song, which seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier. Although we probably did hear Uptown Funk, that song was everywhere. I think another factor is the emergence of online spaces, forums, and communities dedicated to whatever genre or subgenre or microgenre of music that you happen to be into. If, based on whatever playlists on Spotify you were exposed to, you happen to be more inclined toward thrash metal, or hip-hop, or EDM, or indie folk, there was very likely a large, active online place for you to share that love for that music with others. And those online spaces would have been easier to find and more accessible than even 5 years before. Music that got popular and the fandoms driving them had become more fragmented than ever. And I think that's why there's now just a lot less feelings of pride and self-superiority that come with the Lirong generation mentality nowadays. Like, why bother spending time ragging on music you hate when you can just start having fun with music that you like? Especially with pop music becoming much easier to avoid nowadays. And so we get to August 21, 2015. Carly Rae Jepsen, previously known for the massive 2012 pop hit Call Me Maybe, and was, interestingly enough, included in a few of those Lirong generation memes. Oh, hi Carly. Went on to release her third studio album, E-MO-TION. So what do I think of this album? Well, to be completely honest, there's only really two albums that I've listened to in my life more than Emotion. I have every second of this album tattooed onto my soul, onto the very core of my being. I want to be buried with this album, inject this into my veins! Ah! All in all, pretty decent record. This isn't even vinyl, this is just cardboard with a printout. Fake fan alert! What could have just been seen as a typical pop album with a few radio-ready singles and a whole lot of filler was elevated into something way more. Carly approached this whole endeavor with a love that distinguished a lot of great albums that came before it. And the production is just... It was heavily inspired by the synth pop of the 1980s, but with a bombast and polish that makes it ring more than just hollow nostalgia. And while the lyrics may seem fairly typical on the surface, tackling topics like love or heartbreak or intimacy, Carly's delivery is just, it tugs on the heartstrings. She is so sincere, not a hint of cynicism or irony. Carly made and wrote so many songs for this record and gave herself a longer time frame to craft and perfect the album, even having enough material to make Emotion Side B, which is shockingly just as good. Thank you! This is actually very similar to an approach when, 5 years earlier, Swedish artist Robin would release her own pop masterpiece Body Talk. She'd also written a ton of songs that spanned 3 CDs in 1 year. Body Talk is the album with the stone cold pop classic and greatest song of the decade, Dancing on My Own. In an interview with album producer Klaas Alund, he claimed to have watched documentaries on the makings of the Beatles records and Pink Floyd albums, and he realized that Robin and he were putting just as much care and work and effort into Body Talk as those old rock bands were. In fact, Conrad Duncan of Clash magazine wrote of Body Talk, "Body Talk may be the definitive work of Poptimism, written as it was with the belief that pop music could be as grand and meticulous as the classic rock albums of the past." And now, Body Talk is basically on every best albums list ever, including Rolling Stone's 500 greatest albums of all time. Now, in Emotion's case, the shocking thing about this album is just how many units of this album were sold and streamed by the general public. And by that I mean, there were not many units of this album sold and streamed by the general public. In fact, to this day, the biggest song off of Emotion is the kind of ill-fated lead single, I Really Like You, which only has 1/3 of the streams that Call Me Maybe has. And its second single, Run Away With Me, has about 1/10 of the streams. Listen, there's a lot of things that the general public, got wrong in 2015 to 2016, and letting Emotion flop, that's up there. So while E-MO-TION by Carly Rae Jepsen didn't do well commercially, it did get pretty good reviews from a lot of music critics, in particular getting positive reviews from Pitchfork, a publication which started out in the 90s reviewing more alternative and independent stuff that was never in or only bubbling under the mainstream. But even if you weren't reading those publications, Emotion may have still gotten on your radar, with only the coolest online content creators discussing pop music bringing up Emotion, and specifically its second single and other greatest song of the decade, Run Away With Me. For instance, there's Todd in the Shadows, a pretty big YouTuber who always seemed like a pretty big proponent of Poptimism just by the nature of his content.
Someone called me a hater the other day, but I'm not a hater. I don't make these videos because I hate pop music. I do it because I love pop music.
And for the record, he is just like my favorite YouTuber. I love his editing, his writing, his delivery. Anyway, he did start out his career making fun of and mocking pop stars, but also clearly held the genre in high regard, taking the persona, evolution, and music of these pop girls very seriously, and even making a year-end list of the best hit songs of that year every year. All during a time when the Le Wrong Generation mentality was still popular. And in the best list of 2015, he broke his own rules by including the non-hit song Run Away With Me in his honorable mentions.
I don't usually put songs that weren't eligible in the honorable mentions, but this is one of the best songs I've ever heard.
There's also this guy. I don't know that guy. I have no idea. Look, Mike the Snare is a YouTuber who makes really, really good videos on music and art. Anyway, in 2018, Mike the Snare went on to use music theory, aka facts and logic, to objectively prove why Run Away With Me is the best song ever. I also just like the beginning part of this video.
Oh my god, I love this song!
I love this song too!
I too love this song! We all love this song! My name is George W. Bush and I love Carly Rae Jepsen!
But I think one of the biggest endorsements from an online content creator was from the Melon himself, internet's busiest music nerd, Anthony Fantano, and his review on E-MO-TION.
Her and her producers and her writers had some great ears for instrumentation on this thing. You could tell they wanted to keep it new, keep it fresh, keep it contemporary, but in a really strong way reference these pop relics from the 80s in a very tasteful way.
He gives the album a 7 out of 10, which at the time was a pretty high rating for him, especially for a pop album. In that review back in 2015, Fantano even left a comment, "Let's grow up and say this together. I'm not too good for pop music. I'm not too good for pop music." And that's honestly kind of baffling to me in hindsight, when just a few years later, Fantano would go on to rate pop albums from huge name pop stars even higher scores. The album was so influential, in fact, that Fantano would even revisit it 5 years later and heap even more praise on it, talking about how it continued to shape the modern pop landscape.
With E-MO-TION, she dropped a really artistically defining release for her, and I think for just pop music of this past decade as well, which we're still seeing the residuals of now.
But you know what? None of that signifies the true impact of Carly Rae Jepsen's E-MO-TION. A Reddit user named Cappico listened to E-MO-TION and really liked it, but noticed that discussions of Carly Rae Jepsen were not allowed on r/indieheads. I can kind of see why the girl who was responsible for Call Me Maybe wasn't exactly seen as indie, which is a label reserved for artists just bubbling under the mainstream at best. But if I were to speculate, the indie label did also have a lean toward more rock acts who would, be in a band and play their own instruments or all that. And so on August 22, 2015, just one day after E-MO-TION's worldwide release, Cappico would go on to establish the subreddit r/popheads, a dedicated forum toward discussing all things pop stars, pop albums, and pop songs. Now, there obviously have been spaces online where pop fans could congregate and talk about pop stars they like, the most obvious being Tumblr, with some of the indie/pop music exemplifying that sad girl aesthetic that was big on there. Or the righteous defiance of the pop rock girlies who were big on Tumblr too. I think. I'm a little clueless when it comes to Tumblr. Commenters, you have to help me out. Who even was big on Tumblr at the time? And of course, there obviously were individual spaces where fans of specific pop artists could get together, be it Facebook fan pages or groups, or even websites with forums dedicated to said artist. Like if you were a fan of Lady Gaga, you could go to Gaga Daily. If you were a fan of Katy Perry, you could go to Gaga Daily. Stream mayhem! But as far as large, dedicated online spaces to discuss pop music in general, I can't really think of any before Popheads. And you certainly wouldn't find any of those on Reddit. There was an r/music subreddit, but at the time, while not directly antagonistic to pop music like the Defeners were, r/music was fairly dismissive of pop stars, and posts covering pop acts wouldn't get much traction or discussion. Some even had negative top comments, which feels crazy to me now. And so, Popheads was started. It actually grew very slowly at first, potentially through word of mouth, potentially through the growth of content creators engaging with pop music, potentially through the strength and gravitational pull of Charli's album, or maybe all of the above. Popheads continued to grow in stature and followers throughout the years, but one stunt that really took them over the top was on Reddit's Place a Pixel gimmick. Popheads users banded together to place Carly Rae Jepsen's Emotion album cover onto the canvas. See, I told you it was influential. With the subreddit hitting over 1 million followers and still continuing to grow. Now, Popheads is a thriving, well-moderated community with posts about pop music news, releases, music, promos, rates, discussions, retrospectives, and everything in between. And I just think that's so cool. That's cute, but what does that mean for pop music and the general fandom surrounding it? Predictably, a lot of Popheads as a community revolves a lot around the main pop girls. You know, your Taylor Swifts, your Beyoncés, your Arianas, your Billie Eilishes, etc. With such legendary, larger-than-life personas and successful careers, as well as their personal lives seemingly being reflected so transparently in their lyrics, it's honestly easy to get lost in the glamour and drama and the bigness of it all. But just right under the surface, Popheads is also a community of enthusiastic pop fans looking for new artists and new music to engage with. Whether it's just to dance to, or to serve as emotional catharsis, or to make you think, there is no shortage of super cool and talented artists propped up by Popheads. In my experience, there have been quite a few artists who are now among my favorites of all time, who I felt compelled to check out because I heard good things about them on Popheads. And those artists in particular, well, in pop music, it used to be that if you didn't sell a lot of records or make a lot of money, then you flopped, you were considered a failure. But nowadays, it's a lot less about how much you can sell and more about the depth of fan base that you can cultivate. A lot of not quite mainstream pop stars like Caroline Polachek or St. Vincent even leaning on their B-list status for extra cool points. The fact that those pop stars never had a commercial hit is actually a point in their favor, because it gives them that cool hipster cred that a decade and a half before was only afforded to indie rock bands. All the while still willing to embrace the pop label. There was a New York Times article talking about this exact phenomenon, pop's middle class, they called it. Shad D'Souza writes, "The common thread linking these musicians is that they don't treat pop music as a commercial category, but as a discrete musical lineage with its own codes and conventions to be plundered and reinterpreted. It's a point of view that's made possible by the kind of fame the internet has built and fostered. The idea that the term pop star is a measure of clout or name recognition, not a badge that directly correlates to commercial success." There's also something to be said about the global reach of streaming services and even the global community of popheads themselves, which have also affected what music gets popular. Now, obviously, I can't speak for every pop fan or every Popheads user, but there seems to be way more of a willingness to listen to pop music from every corner of the globe, from artists with different cultural backgrounds. It's just cool to see acts like Bad Bunny or BTS regarded with the same reverence as The Weeknd. And I guess it's not a secret that a substantial portion of Popheads are LGBTQ+, as reflected in this 2020's Popheads survey showing that 2/3 identified themselves as non-straight and only 92% identifying as cisgender. This may certainly have had its roots in its queer-friendly spaces that disco cultivated back in the day, or it could also be that for a lot of queer folks, main pop girls represent a flamboyance and freedom and even femininity that could be seen as an ideal.
And perhaps the struggle of being a famous woman pop star just resonated with other marginalized folks.
And now, if you're a young queer pop fan, you likely have no shortage of potential LGBTQ+ role models that you could look up to in the pop world, with acts like Chappell Roan, Lil Nas X, Sam Smith, Troye Sivan, Boy Genius, and just so many others. And this freedom to express oneself isn't just limited in one's identity, but is also reflected in the music, with pop artists really pushing the envelope of what constitutes as pop. Many pop acts nowadays borrow from other time periods, other genres, or even just making their own thing to create sounds that feel remarkably futuristic and fresh, while still maintaining the hookiness and catchiness of a pop song. Rest in peace, the late great Sophie. And for me, personally, what's most exciting is the large ecosystem of content creators that discuss and engage with pop music and artists that go way beyond celebrity gossip and pointless negativity. These people really take pop music of the past and present seriously, like AJ, Spectrum Pulse, Naomi Cannibal, Honest, Sean Faye Wolf, and of course, the OG, best YouTuber ever, Todd in the Shadows, do not at me. Now, of course, I'm not saying that pop music and pop music discourse online is perfect. Far from it. For instance, there's a lot about stan culture and pop Twitter that I really dislike. I don't like how other pop stars, journalists, critics, or random citizens will experience bullying, bigotry, harassment, or worse at the hands of unhinged stans if they were to say anything less than perfect about their faves. On a lighter note, as early as 2014, there has been worry if Poptimism might ruin the discourse, forcing critics to kowtow to pop fandoms, who are not only some of the most vicious music fan bases, but also some of the most lucrative. We are already well past that point, I swear. It feels like every week Billboard has this new engagement tactic where it's like, top 100 pop whatever of the 21st century, and Taylor Swift is inevitably gonna be number one. But from where we started, honestly, I'm glad. I'm happy that there's less of a stigma to listen to the music that you like, and how you can just let other people enjoy things. I'm happy that LGBTQ+ folks can find solace in music that is also popular and that speaks to their unique struggles. I'm happy that there are artists and creators willing to take pop music and all its storied history seriously and to create their own cool new things. And most of all, I'm happy that at the time of me writing this, Mayhem is still #1 on Billboard. Yes, queen! Thank you so much for watching until the end. I cannot believe we're at 10,000 subscribers now, which has like been a dream to me. But honestly, just the fact that I have any kind of audience is so surreal. So just like, thank you for watching. If you're new to the channel, you could subscribe and see my own take, my own twist about this weird intersection between the internet and pop culture. But otherwise, I appreciate that you're here, and thank you so much for watching till the end. Bye-bye.